Look real close at this map of Washington, D.C. This is D.C. in 1845. Okay, now look, here it comes. Boom, D.C. in 1847. If you really strained, you may have noticed they chopped her in two. Good eyes, champ. This change in the territory of D.C. is known as the Retrocession of Alexandria, because Alexandria retroceded, left D.C., and went back to Virginia. The District of Columbia was 100 square miles, incorporating both land ceded by the state of Maryland and Alexandria, ceded by the state of Virginia. George Washington personally selected the area for the District of Columbia along the Potomac, and roughly 2/3 of the area to be the capital city of these United States, 68 square miles, were ceded by Maryland, and the other third, 31 square miles, ceded by Virginia. A nice, square Washington, D.C. President Washington always wanted Alexandria to be a part of the district. He even issued a proclamation to that effect in January 1790. Quote, "The said district 10 square miles shall be found by running 4 lines of experiment in the following manner. That is to say, running from the courthouse in Alexandria and Virginia, and the said 4 lines which shall be within the state of Maryland and above the eastern branch, and all that part within the said 4 lines of experiment which shall be within the Commonwealth of Virginia." Whew! Doozy of a quote. I gotta go somewhere else. So, I've come down here to Alexandria, Virginia, which if you're local from DC, you know is like coming to another planet, to find a very special spot. I'm currently walking through Old Town Alexandria. I'm heading south. Let's see if I can find this very special spot. One thing about Alexandria, Old Town Alexandria, is it's like super pretty. It's like I'm walking around and there's like all of these little row houses. They're very cute. They look very colonial, not in the pejorative sense, of course. There's American flags everywhere, cobblestone street. I'm walking through a neighborhood right now, but I see some greenery ahead, which means I'm getting really close to my destination. Okay, so I made it to Joins Point Park. There you can see a little better. And I'm gonna be following the map to a very special spot. Okay, so I made it to the southernmost point of the park. And as you can see behind me, there is something that's being generously called a lighthouse. I think this will... Actually, you know what? It's not generous. It's very literal. That is a house with a light on it. Okay, so I'm behind the lighthouse now. I'm going to walk right over here because underneath my feet right now, sorry, I wasn't even in the shot. Underneath my feet right now is a District of Columbia boundary stone. And in fact, it was the OG boundary stone of the District of Columbia dating back to like 1792. Again, I'm not in the District of Columbia right now. I'm in Alexandria, Virginia. This was the place that marked the southernmost tip of the District of Columbia right here. Okay, it wasn't good enough for me. As you can see, I'm down here. That's the Potomac. Oh my God, this doesn't feel like stable ground. I'm about to turn the camera around and show you what I wanted to show you all along. There it is. The original boundary stone of the District of Columbia, 1792, the very first boundary stone. They used to go out in 10-mile increments all the way to make the square of the District of Columbia. Now, of course, where I'm standing right now is no longer part of the District of Columbia. Alexandria is a totally different place now. But really, Alexandria was different before, too. The early days as part of DC don't seem to have been happy times for the people of Alexandria, or at least for the class of people able to participate in power. While Alexandria was placed squarely under control of the federal government, there were some points of confusion and resentment. The early strains on Alexandria as part of DC revolve around 2 problems. 1, weird laws, and 2, no national voting. The first problem, weird laws, starts with construction. The 1791 Act of Congress establishing the district also received an amendment titled, aptly, an act to amend an act for establishing the temporary and permanent seat of the government of the United States. It stipulated that areas like Alexandria, even though they were part of the District of Columbia, couldn't have any shiny new federal buildings. Quote, "Nothing herein contained shall authorize the erection of public buildings otherwise than on the Maryland side of the River Potomac." In other words, don't put federal buildings in Alexandria. It's the law. But why? I had to ask someone.
So I'm an old Virginia boy. I'm actually a 10th generation Virginian, and I grew up in Richmond where they teach you things like you're a 10th generation Virginian and therefore you must behave a certain way. They also try to teach you how to think a certain way. That one didn't take all so well.
That's Charlie Grimes, former adjunct professor at George Mason and the mind behind the website that was so darn useful for this video, virginiaplaces.org. I asked him why federal buildings couldn't go on the Alexandria side of the Potomac. Do you know why that prohibition on building in Alexandria was put in place?
The original Residence Act excluded Alexandria from the boundaries of the District of Columbia. George Washington boldly announced where he was going to establish the boundaries, and then the Congress changed the Residence Act in order to authorize what George had already said. So points to George for being a leader on that. It is I think, a set of political compromises between the folks who were going to be affected in Georgetown and the folks that were potentially going to have to move from Philadelphia down to this new capital in the middle of nowhere, and getting Alexandria added into the district. I suspect the motivations in there's a compromise that said, well, sure, we can add Alexandria, but you can't get all the economic development in the Alexandria portion. It didn't benefit Maryland. It didn't benefit Virginia. Both states lost the opportunity for the economic development. So neither one really should have had a dog in the fight for which side of the river got public buildings. So my guess is that it's the landowners that were in the Maryland portion that probably whispered in a few ears, and George says, well, if you add Alexandria, I can go with that.
Set across the Potomac from the rest of the capital city, this lack of federal development must have felt isolating. Alexandrians must have looked longingly over the Potomac, wishing for a bit of the action they saw over the river, resentful that the thing precluding them from a share was bureaucratic. Speaking of the river, another economic issue was that Congress created 2 counties for the District of Columbia. The parts which formerly belonged to Maryland became Washington County, and the part ceded from Virginia, Alexandria County. And then Congress made the extraordinary decision to give both of them joint jurisdiction over the Potomac River. What could possibly go wrong?
Do you know why in this 1801 Organic Act, the jurisdiction of the river was basically given in an inconclusive way where both areas had claim over the river and could basically fight as children in the back seat over projects?
Well, you've just moved the national government from Philadelphia to Washington. You don't have a lot of facilities in which to meet. There's 1,000,001 challenges and problems to deal with. Legislatively dealing with the crime on the river or someone who dies and an estate needs to be settled is rather low on the priority list for the U.S. Congress. So as I intuit it, they said, well, we'll just let the existing structure of laws for Alexandria County and for Washington County, because remember the city of Alexandria, city of Washington, city of Georgetown are separate jurisdictions within the District of Columbia, plus they're the 2 counties. So they said, look, if anything goes wrong on the river and somebody has to deal with it in a police administrative way, we'll just go with whatever the counties are doing. And we're not going to pick Maryland versus Virginia. We'll just let them work it out as it happens.
Looking back on it with all this hindsight, it seems like there wasn't really a lot of planning for this, right? They didn't plan ahead for this sort of thing. They just kind of went for it and decided to roll with the punches.
That's Michael Lee Pope, journalist and author of The Hidden History of Alexandria, D.C. Michael writes in his book that Alexandria was a weird place when it first came into the district.
It was kind of always a little bit of an awkward fit because the rest of the District of Columbia, the rest of that diamond shape was intact and you could travel around. Over here in Alexandria, we're separated by the Potomac River. So there was always that separation there. And you had this real weird legal situation where the code of Virginia was frozen in time. So any changes that Virginia made to the Virginia code did not apply to Alexandria, D.C. So they had like this very archaic system of justice. Even for the time, it was an archaic system of justice that prescribed the death penalty for very minor cases of theft or stealing $4 worth of merchandise, that sort of thing.
Even when development plans were approved in this part of DC, prohibitions and weird laws notwithstanding, fate intervened to make things difficult. For example, when a plan for a canal was approved by Congress in 1812, something that could have made Alexandria feel more integrated into DC, a certain War of 1812 with Great Britain started immediately thereafter and delayed the whole project. During the War of 1812, Alexandria surrendered to the British. The British passed through and occupied Alexandria for 5 days, taking wealth and goods, but leaving the citizenry alive and property mostly intact. Alexandria, quote, allowed itself to be occupied by the British while the White House and Capitol burned. Michael Lee Pope humorously pointed out that the occupation of Alexandria is not the kind of thing the city's marketing department includes in brochures.
It's debatable how you want to perceive Alexandria's actions, because some people believe that the actions of Alexandria saved the city. And there are many buildings in Alexandria today that are currently existing that would not be there if the British had burned them down in 1814. Because what happened after they left Alexandria is they went to DC and burned the whole thing thing down.
You know, something I spoke with Michael Lee about, and actually Michael Lee Pope, and his portrayal was that the Alexandrians acted quite practically in 1812. They weren't exactly like the pride of the nation. They absolutely let the British do what they wanted, but it was contingent upon, hey, don't burn everything down. Just take what you want. Perhaps fly the flag, that's a point of contention. Perhaps fly the Union Jack. But more importantly, like, just don't burn us to the ground here, and we'll just kind of let you hang out.
Right, they had no military option. They had no opportunity to say no, but maybe they didn't have to provide all of the labor they provided to help empty the warehouses.
The way he put it was like the Alexandrian Tourist Board doesn't mention the War of 1812 in their brochures. I thought was pretty good.
Yeah, we'll learn more about the brewing beer and making bricks in Alexandria than we will about one of the big military activities that occurred there.
So here we are. Weird laws, economic disparity, development issues, even war occupation all serve to make Alexandrians feel a separation and isolation from the rest of DC. But here's a big question. Could the people of Alexandria act to make change to this situation? And that brings us to another big problem: voting. The 1801 Organic Act took the people in what would become the District of Columbia away from Maryland and Virginia. This meant they lost the right to vote for members of Congress and for president. Alexandrians were no longer Virginians and therefore no longer lived in a state, and so had no say in the federal government. No vote for Congress, no vote for president, and since Congress had control over DC, no vote to change an unfavorable local situation either. If a property-owning white male in Alexandria felt they were dealt a bad economic hand and had no ability to change that situation through voting, well, it's no wonder there were constant murmurs for retrocession to Alexandria, to get back to a state of the Union, to a situation in which political participation was more straightforward.
At the time, people that lived in the district could not vote for president. There was no way for them to vote for president. And so if you look at all those presidential elections between 1800 and the Civil War, you will see there is no data for Alexandria voting patterns in terms of the presidential preference, because they were not allowed to vote for president in that time period. So this was another thing that was really part of the public debate. When you go back and look at speeches, it was about representation in Congress and not being able to vote for president, and just essentially being a mismatch with the District of Columbia.
It's no surprise then that a new retrocession movement gained 40% support. There had been rumblings of retrocession in the 1820s, but by 1840, momentum was building. Alexandria couldn't have federal buildings. They had sibling fights over the Potomac. They were criticized for surrendering to the British in 1812. They had old Virginia legal codes, and they were disenfranchised from voting to make a change to any of this. Did I miss anything, Mr. Producer? Yes. Yes, I did. Another big reason Alexandria had issues being part of DC: slavery. In my opinion, the issue of slavery was the final push that made all this retrocession talk come to a head. Alexandria was the center of the slave trade in the region, and if abolitionists helped ban the slave trade in the district, that would naturally include Alexandria as part of the district.
This is a very important part of the story, which is it's not just about Alexandria, it's actually about the entire District of Columbia at that time, was the ground zero for the abolitionist movement. And if you were an abolitionist in the 1840s or the 1850s, you came to Washington, D.C. to rabble-rouse and advocate in favor of the abolition of slavery. And so the population of rabble-rousing abolitionists in the District of Columbia grew so exponential that people here in Alexandria who owned the slave market, one of the largest slave markets in the country, were really concerned about, hey, wait a second, we got all these abolitionists in Washington, D.C. Pretty soon, they're going to be advocating for the abolition of slavery in D.C., and that would cause a problem for the slave market.
The interests of these slavers cannot be dismissed from the history of retrocession. Indeed, while the importation and exportation of slaves was outlawed in DC in 1850, the institution continued in Alexandria until the end of the Civil War. The timing of the retrocession of Alexandria just before the slave trade ban was simple foresight. So now we know the various reasons why Alexandria wanted to leave DC. So how'd they do it? There was discourse and informal annual polling, which agitated for retrocession really from the moment Alexandria joined DC.
I would go back to really the trigger here is 1836, when the threat of ending slavery in the District of Columbia becomes most real, at which point there's an 1840 referendum in Alexandria. City residents are in favor of retrocession and the county residents are opposed to retrocession. The timing was not suitable under Martin Van Buren in 1840, but by 1846, Polk is president. He's a driver in terms of implementing his agenda. He's very successful in accomplishing what he wants to accomplish. The Alexandrians say, well, let's just go back and try again. And they picked a time when the circumstances enabled them to get the U.S. Congress to say, sure, there's a smoke-filled room with a deal somewhere where somebody says, look, let Virginia get this back and we'll do something in exchange that you want. The timing was just right in 1846. It had not been right in 1840, not been right in 1832, not been right in 1803, not been right in all those other times when people proposed it. But they picked the magic moment, and it happened once.
The U.S. House took up retrocession in May 1846. The bill called for a referendum in Alexandria County to decide if it should go back to Virginia. A couple months later, the bill passed the Senate. President Polk signed the law on July 9th, 1846. That September, white male voters in Alexandria participated in yet another referendum on retrocession. The final vote was 763 in favor to 222 opposed. A large majority of the 1,000-ish participants voted to go back to Virginia. After the referendum, President Polk issued a proclamation. It is enacted that, with the assent of the people of the county and town of Alexandria, all that portion of the District of Columbia ceded to the United States by the state of Virginia shall be ceded and forever relinquished. Here's the map I showed you at the start of the video. Again, look closely. There it is, DC cut in two. The land area of DC was reduced by 31 square miles, roughly 1/3. Now, Alexandria's story is often forgotten, and it's a nice curiosity to enhance your trivia skills or small talk, but there's also a lesson here. My conversation with Charlie Grimes helped me get to that lesson. It's a thought on identity.
But I'm actually happy we're talking because I think the general perspective of identity matters too. Where do you really belong? And in the end, 50 years as part of a place might just not be enough. It's making me think, and that's good.
If you are, well, I'll give myself a checkpoint for making somebody think, even though I'm not an official teacher anymore.
In this period we're discussing, between the founding and the Civil War, Americans identified more with their states than with the country. A great example can be found in this very story. George Washington, being a Virginia man, wanted a part of his beloved Virginia within the country's capital. People identified as Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, Carolinians, and American identity and nationalism was not particularly present. It even extended to grammar. Today we say the United States is the land of opportunity. The United States is this, is that. But states is a plural word. And in the past, people said the United States are. The United States are acting, are expanding. It's a grammatical reflection of the puzzle pieces of states shoved together rather than the singular entity of the Union, which Abraham Lincoln heralded and defended during the Civil War.
I'm really glad you mentioned the idea of perhaps pride in being a Virginia itself, especially in this moment in American history when people might not have thought of themselves as Americans first, but rather of Virginians first, or Marylanders.
Absolutely, and you see that at the start of the Civil War, where these people who have spoken an oath to defend the Constitution and are serving in the military choose to resign from the U.S. military to be part of their state's leadership rather than their nation's leadership. So their commitment to this national United States of America, I think those of us that grew up after World War II, when the United States has been a superpower all our lives, don't seem to understand so clearly how we were a dinky nation of minor significance, struggling. I mean, here's Jefferson struggling to convince the French that we've even got art, science, and our animals as big as their animals. And so we're more committed to being Virginians and our New Yorkers than we're committed necessarily to being Americans. And when the push comes to shove in 1861, a surprising number of Virginians stayed with the Union government, but most of the leaders in the military bailed.
And I think the point here is that our identities today are beginning to reflect that early American sentiment that we aren't so much a single union, but rather a series of cities, states, communities, demographics with unique beliefs shoved into a larger political unit, a sanitized federal system devoid of nationalist romanticism. Americans today are divided. In fact, to a large extent, we've come to see those with whom we disagree as not mere political rivals, but enemies. Folks with whom we don't even share values. And to be clear, I'm not about to argue we should give our political opponents big hugs and come together for conversation or whatever pithy cliche people use when they get squeamish about conflict. I think disagreement can be legitimate. Conflict can clarify. We might not share values with our political opponents. I offer you no kumbaya. Instead, the takeaway for you here is not about passing judgment on division. I only mean to describe it. It seems clear from my reading that Alexandria never fit into the District of Columbia. Alexandrians never ceased to identify as Virginians, despite being in Washington for decades. They were never Washingtonians. And because being a Virginian was a large part of identity, because an American identity was still infant, it was easier to agitate for retrocession. It was a logical outflowing of Virginian identity. The 20th century saw a total American identity come into its own. The victories in World Wars I and II, the boom of the 50s, social development and counterculture of the 60s, New Deals and great societies. Even if it was a mirage or social construction, there was undoubtedly an American identity. But if you saw my recent interview with Professor Steinhorn, you know that distrust was coming. The Vietnam War in particular hurt trust in American government, raised populist grievance, sowed the seeds of some of our divisions today, salted the earth of American cohesion. And here now it is my opinion that we are returning to our original state. Pun intended. We are identifying less with the country or the nation and choosing to lean into smaller identities. Some are demographic, others geographic. We are Virginians again, Washingtonians, Texans. Americans second? Not yet. Still, it is a time for small community, not the large. For forums, not friends. We retrocede identity or find new identity. As we move forward in time, we are starting to look like ourselves from the past. At least, I see it that way. Do you? First, I've put the full interviews with Michael Pope and Charlie Grimes on Patreon and Nebula. Links in the description. Second, if you're a part of the passionate subset of my audience who loves this local history stuff, I need your support. Patreon.com/William C. Fox. Later, y'all.